Let's talk about
politics, environmental science,
global warming,
constitutional rights,
social and economic challenges,
money, power, choice.
Nature does not compromise.
Extreme droughts, extreme heat waves.
Sea levels are rising, and it is about climate change.
This is the future of the next generations.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Let's Talk About Climate, a podcast where we talk about climate change and how it relates to all of us. Join us, the Change the Chamber Fellows, as we talk with scientists, grassroots campaigners, politicians, and more as we open up the conversation on climate. I'm Monica, a fellow with Change the Chamber, and today I'm here with Sarah, another fellow, to begin to demystify economies and sustainability, or inclusive solidarity economies. Welcome.
Awesome. Thank you for that introduction, Monica. So to sort of again introduce us in or kick it off, I know not everyone may be familiar with economic sustainability terms. So I'm just going to briefly review like a sustainable economy. I do understand. That basic definition is sort of putting economy with definition of sustainability. So it's an economy that meets present needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Um, and then a sustainability economy, I think, can seem a little more complex. Can you tell me what that means and is all about, Monica?
Definitely. And a solidarity economy is also definitely a type of sustainable economy, right? The basic idea is to provide a real alternative to the shortcomings of capitalism and other economic systems that are currently in place all over the world. And a lot of it relies on the idea of communities and people governing themselves through participatory democracy, cooperative and public ownership of resources, of land, of knowledge, of leadership and ownership over different community decision-making processes and things like that, and a culture of solidarity and respect for each other as individuals in a community and for the earth and the environment that we live within. So a lot of it comes down to prioritizing, again, people as a community and the planet that we get all of our resources from, which again kind of ties into this idea of a sustainable economy in a way that a lot of times capitalistic systems don't, in terms of prioritizing it within a solidarity economy, prioritizing the idea of people and the planet over just profit and exploitation and endless growth, without keeping in mind people's own ability to thrive in their communities and the planet's ability to thrive for the long term. So the way that a lot of this is done is through more collective decision making, including people whose voices historically have not been uplifted and included in government decision making, in policy making, over the long term, generationally, people who haven't had access to as much economic mobility or financial resources. And so kind of getting into the history of that, the idea of the solidarity economy, at least in that form, can be traced back to as early as 1937, when a leader named Felipe Alais used it as an economic organizing concept among worker cooperatives during the Spanish Civil War. And then the idea and these movements kind of gained a lot of traction in Latin America, especially over the last 20 years, as a lot of workers in the region have been making more demands to expand forms of social inclusion and unity and economic prosperity for people beyond just like the top 1%. Yeah, and so there's a lot of different practices that we'll kind of get into throughout the episode, in terms of what that looks like in communities and how we kind of bring back this idea of economic growth to redistribute resources more equitably, how to humanize the economy, and basically create communities and systems that serve the people in a way that works for everybody.
That's so cool.
So I guess now that I've kind of explained some of the basic concepts of a solidarity economy, Sarah, do you have any ideas to share with our listeners about why it's important to think about alternatives to capitalism, especially right now?
Yeah, I think you sort of overviewed this a little, and thank you for that because it helps me formulate my own ideas, and also sort of strengthens what I was already thinking. So my first thought, is like you were talking about under our current capitalism, there's often, or there is a lot of overconsumption of natural resources, leading to environmental degradation and the current climate crisis that we're
Yeah.
in. So obviously coming from the environmental field, that's the lens I immediately approach this problem with. Um, but there are also other reasons like technological change, which under capitalism and under any society is good, of course. But under capitalism that we currently have, the benefits often are not equally shared, like you were talking about. Um, so it's that focus on maximizing profit in capitalism that can overlook social needs like health, education, and historical discrimination um, that leaves us on uneven footing in capitalism in our planet, on our planet. That the solidarity economy, now that you've talked about it, I think could really address more. So I'm interested in hearing what else you have to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's absolutely true in terms of you kind of mentioned income inequality and things like that and inequitable distribution of resources. And I think there's this idea of abundance and kind of this like abundance mindset that's gained a lot of traction on a personal level in a lot of self-help books and podcasts and other resources that have been circulating on the internet and just kind of like in like public discourse. And I think that's where like the solidarity economy and other forms of more sustainable economic systems try to emphasize this abundance mindset on a collective level, at the level of communities or entire countries or the entire world, where if we were more equally distributing resources and access to decision-making power, there's enough to go around for everybody. And so there's no need for these really extreme yeah, these like extremes on either side of growing wealth gaps and financial and other resources being distributed so inequitably between the most wealthy and increasingly just the middle and lower classes that are growing. And so I think that's where a lot of people are seeing this. We're seeing this in the news. We're seeing this in our communities, in our families and friends. There's a lot of, I think, conversations about these growing income gaps among exploitation of workers and of resources that I think is a huge part of the public discourse and like public conversation right now. So I think a lot of people acknowledge that there's these broken systems and they just feel very entrenched in our national culture, in this kind of like individualistic mindset where we are all individually kind of looking for financial stability and economic
Yeah, it's easy
prosperity.
to get stuck there.
Exactly, for like our own selves and our families, of course. Um, but it's kind of difficult to imagine a strong alternative to the system that's existed for so long. And that can feel really discouraging, and it's kind of hard to think about how we would even go about fixing that. Um, so to our audience as well, if you have other ideas on this or other thoughts, feel free to comment on our video. We'll talk a little bit more about um, maybe let's recap some of the key principles first, and then we'll kind of get into some examples of what this looks like on a community level, just to kind of help our audience visualize and think about what this might look like.
Definitely.
So Sarah, do you want to, just to see if you understand the solidarity economy, kind of let's summarize what we've talked about so far in terms of key principles and practices, and then we'll get into some more tangible examples.
Sounds great. So I know a lot of what you talked about was like cooperation over competition. So getting out of this resource scarcity mind, but into abundance for all that we can share. Um, so sort of I'm not sure if self-governance would be the exact word because it's a little bit of that along with democracy. Um, but also definitely focusing on equitable distribution of decision-making power and economic and other resources, as well as I think environmental and social justice sort of has to be a component of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially fixing a lot of the systems that are broken and a lot of the consequences that existing capitalistic structures and other just unjust discriminatory systems that have existed for so long. That's where I really like the idea of a solidarity economy encompassing both environmental and social aspects of community and kind of just what does it mean for entire communities to thrive together and actually include everyone, especially people who historically have been left out of decision-making processes. Um, so I think now that we've gone over what the solidarity economy is, let's go ahead and talk about some examples of it, what it might look like in practice, some of the structures that are historically associated with it, and can actually be implemented on a community level. We'll start off with some things that you may have already noticed in your own community or may at least have heard of or even like participated in, whether through shopping or volunteering, things like that. One really common example, I think that's common even in a lot of urban communities now, community gardens and farm cooperatives, um, which are, I think, a pretty like accessible example for us to kind of start off talking about in terms of this idea of collective ownership and this idea that the land and its resources belong to everyone instead of just a very select wealthy few and are managed by the people who actively use them. And this, I think, is honestly a really strong system, especially for kind of getting around this idea of like tragedy of the commons and like people
Mhm.
overexploiting land for purely short-term profits and not really thinking about what this means for the long term and not treating it like a dispensable resource that like, we can always get more of, which of course is not the case. Um, so not only do community gardens and farm co-ops, one, reduce the reliance on large industrial food systems that tend to exploit employees and land and animals as well, and kind of bring ownership and solidarity back to local economies, which also helps communities to be self-sufficient, um, and kind of bring down prices and kind of increase ownership over local food systems, which I think is
Yeah,
also,
definitely.
yeah, really great for addressing food deserts and such and rising food prices and inflation that are impacting a lot of us today. Um, Again, like this kind of goes back to the idea of collective ownership with all people who are involved in the production of their own food, having voting and decision-making rights, can making decisions about finances, operations, um, I think also just like having a stake in the quality of the food and like the kind of smaller decisions that go into yeah, just having like ownership over what we're putting in our bodies, what we're using to feed our families, things like that.
Definitely.
Um there's a lot of other models as well that you may have heard of from things like community land trusts to housing cooperatives, time banking, participatory budgeting. There was recently an example in Seattle, Washington, where the city allocated $30 million to a participatory budgeting process that basically gives members a say in how all of that money should be used. And so the outcome of that was $12 million being diverted from the Seattle Police Department, with the remaining 18 million coming from the mayor's community initiative funds. And so I think there was a great quote from an article that I read on this example, saying that those closest to the problems are closest to the solutions. And I think
I
that's
love
from
that.
my background in social entrepreneurship is a really common thing that we talk about, right? We're like pushing down decision-making power and innovative power to people who are closest to the issues and the people who are most um, closely involved in experiencing the effects of an issue on a day-to-day basis, are often the people who are best equipped and will come up with the most effective solutions to those problems. Which kind of, if you're seeing the theme here with like solidarity economies, the idea of local decision-making power and community decision-making power and ownership is a really big idea, which again, one, which is great for, again, just the effectiveness of these solutions. They can be really tailored to a certain community, a certain city, a certain town, and can really be kind of tailored to what people in a certain region actually need. I think the other benefit that's really great about this really local focus is that systems change can really start at that local level. And so I think that also makes us feel a little bit more realistic, a little bit more approachable than this idea of finding this global alternative to capitalism that has to kind of, again, come from the top down. And they're really simple structures, things like community gardens or things like land trusts or participatory budgeting on even a very small local level, just makes it feel like these are actual decisions where you could go to a town hall and bring this up to your mayor, or you could go to a school board and kind of talk to a public school system about implementing some of these systems. And I think that feels very realistic, feels very tailored to a community again. Um, yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or other examples that we want to
Um,
talk about.
no, that's amazing, Monica. And I think you really took us through like a whole deep dive a little bit into it. But if you do have any more things you really want to share, obviously I'd love to hear it. But I think you also got into how people can really advocate for having a solidarity economy. So talking about advocating for policy changes, like you were talking about going to town halls. I think that's amazing. And if you have any more examples you want to share, or even if you just want to talk about how else people can really sort of start getting solidarity economy to be what we're using, I think that would be amazing. And I've learned so much already.
Yeah, awesome. Well, let's talk about a few more examples. Another one that comes to mind is an organization called Cooperation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, that's built a community production center that has shared resources like 3D printers, other forms of digital fabrication that, again, can be shared for basically improving access to creative power and creative resources for the entire community. The organization also has financial resources dedicated to affordable housing and farming, as well as to the preservation of important historical sites for civil rights and Black liberation struggles and the commemoration of those movements. The community center that we were just talking about also has spaces for gathering, community education, childcare, a shopping plaza for a food co-op and other cooperative businesses. So again, a lot of this just comes down to redistribution of existing resources and also just improving access to those resources for more members of the community. I think a lot of, I guess one more topic that I kind of wanted to talk about when we talk about local community structures and sustainable economies is social sustainability as well, in terms of creating a society that supports the building of interpersonal skills, healthier relationships among community members, which also not only at an individual level improves emotional intelligence and kind of investment into one's own community, but also just helps to build resilience, right? Build relationships where when people encounter a challenge as a community, whether that's a natural disaster, another environmental struggle, or whether those are more social struggles, I think a lot of times that's evident right now as well, right? Where there's a lot of
Definitely.
social unrest and a lot of political and social and environmental challenges, where if we have those social support networks that begin, of course, like on a family and friend level, but also at a community level, um, that, of course, doesn't fix large systemic issues, um, but definitely helps us to be more resilient in addressing them together. And of course, like together, we're much stronger. Together, we can build more effective, more long-term solutions. And so I think like that element of it as well as kind of exemplified by these community centers and these cooperative structures, I think does a really good job at building that resilience starting at a community level. Um,
Definitely.
yeah,
And that like being together also goes back to help us all individually, like you were talking about. I think that's inspiring and something, of course, we need right now, but always as well.
yeah. And I think so. I think both of us are based in the United States, where um, some of these structures, as we just mentioned, are kind of gaining some footing. But there's a lot of big kind of solidarity economy networks and institutions that are promoting these structures all over the world, from Brazil to Canada to Japan to Italy to Kenya. So these are structures that are gaining a lot of popularity and a lot of success around the world, which I think just goes to show that these are really realistic alternatives to a lot of the, I guess, flawed structures um, that a lot of us find really challenging to navigate at the moment. But I think also give us a lot of hope for the future in terms of taking example from other communities where these structures have been implemented and finding ways to make them work for our own communities because they're really flexible in that way. Um, yeah, and so I think, Sarah, you talked about advocating for policy changes, um, kind of building these community structures from the ground up, meaning at a local level,
Mhm.
and then expanding the idea to more regional and even national levels in the United States. I think another way to kind of get involved in supporting the rise of solidarity economies on an individual level beyond advocating for policy change is this idea of quote unquote voting with our wallets. Um, and so where you choose to spend your money in terms of purchasing from worker cooperatives or more democratically run businesses, we've seen these kind of behaviors a lot in terms of boycotting businesses that don't align with one's values or choosing to shop at locally owned businesses, women-owned businesses, Black-owned businesses, just things like that, where if we start supporting the community structures that we want to see, um, in addition to like relying on economic subsidies from the government and such, we can begin to kind of subsidize or at least promote these structures with the financial resources that we currently have on individual and community levels. Um, that can also include things like putting our money in credit unions as opposed to large privately owned banks,
Yep.
supporting worker cooperatives where employees all have an equal say in decision making. Um, and then I think also, like, as usual, educating yourself is a great way to kind of learn more about how you can begin to spread awareness among your own friends and your peers and colleagues. One website that I would definitely recommend visiting is the New Economy Coalition website at neweconomy.net to learn a little bit more about all of these different structures in terms of what they look like with land ownership, businesses, education, things like that. And also just like learn about, explore their blogs and their news stories to learn about structures that are being used to build regional solidarity economies. They have resource libraries that kind of break down a lot of these processes and help to train individuals on how to get these kinds of things started in their own communities. Um, so I think those are three really great places to start, right? Policy
Yeah.
change, using our own resources, and then of course educating and informing ourselves.
Yeah, and that's
Um,
a amazing website you shared. I'll definitely use it to educate myself more too. So I think as a reflection question, both for our audience as well as for ourselves, I know I just wanted to think about it and pose it of what is your vision for an ideal economy? And Monica, I know you're in this Beyond Anti-Capitalism team and reducing economic insecurity. So have you thought about this a lot? Can you share?
Definitely. Definitely. And I think to answer that question for my own self, a lot of it comes down to a lot of the principles we've talked about today. So one of those being systems that allow everybody in a community to thrive, that uplift and empower, especially voices that historically have been silenced and disenfranchised and kept away from decision-making power. And again, this idea of emphasizing abundance and kind of reframing our mindset and thinking about that everybody can thrive, everybody can prosper. It'll take some strategic decision making and it'll take some strategic reallocation of resources from how they're currently distributed in our economic system. But it's really, really possible to imagine a future that works for everyone, that allows everyone to, again, um, live in a community that's resilient, that supports their goals, that allows them to thrive both socially, financially, um, economically. Um, yeah, and basically just like this idea of envisioning communities that are sorry, that are resilient, that are healthy, that of course are equipped to kind of handle the changes that are coming with the climate crisis that's already affecting a lot of us. But I think like keeping that kind of like realistic hope that there's alternatives out there, I think is really important to not get discouraged, to understand that there's realistic solutions that we ourselves can begin advocating for, whether you're in a position of political or policy making power right now or not. There's ways for all of us to get involved, and it's really going to take that collective effort for us to make systems level changes. So that's what I would say.
I think that that's great, honestly. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I could have said it much better. Yeah. I was just thinking basically for the long term, obviously sustainable is what
Yep.
we need. But I think a lot of what you said is what goes into that being sustainable.
Yeah, definitely.
So before I close us out, just because you've had so much amazing stuff to share, and I feel like I've been educated through this too. Usually we give guests on our podcast who aren't from Change the Chamber a minute to talk about whatever they're excited about coming up. And I wanted to offer you the same opportunity.
Okay, sure. I think within Change the Chamber, there's a lot of really exciting initiatives that, of course, a lot of our teams are working on. I think specifically for me, something that I'm really enthusiastic about is working with Deborah Rowe on a more entertainment and like media industry focused initiative that we're working on in hoping to promote climate realistic solutions and narratives in film, in journalism, in mainstream media. Again, kind of getting people energized beyond the kind of like very dystopian narratives that are really prevalent when we're discussing the climate crisis and environmental degradation, and a lot of those really real issues that of course are challenging our communities and our whole world at large. Um, but I think it's a space that's new to me, and so it's kind of exciting to learn about all the different players in like the film and entertainment industries, kind of learning about who makes those decisions, how stories kind of get from the kind of creative and like creative conception process to production and distribution to like public audiences. So that's been really exciting to navigate. And again, I think it's just a very new way of thinking about education and awareness that I hadn't thought about as much before this. But I'm really excited about it because I feel like it has a lot of potential. Again, I'm like talking to a lot of new people, learning from a lot of new people about, yeah, an industry that's really new to me. But I love how creative it is. I love how diverse it is, and just how powerful of a platform it could be for the kinds of messages that we're hoping to share more widespread to even audiences who haven't learned as much about the climate crisis and
Very
potential
true.
like solutions to it. So that's something that's really exciting to me.
Thank you for sharing. And also to our listeners, thank you for listening to this episode of Let's Talk About Climate. Before you go, don't forget to like, subscribe, and rate us 5 stars on your podcast platform. Follow us on Instagram at Let's Talk About Climate Pod and Twitter at Talk Climate Pod, and check out our website at changethechamber.org. You can find all the links in the description, as well as we'll put in the link to the resource where you can educate yourself as well. So this was Let's Talk About Climate. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.